Diolch yn fawr. I'm going to speak in English this evening, and I'm also, I've had something very strange happening to me just now. My laptop has put the camera at the back of the screen, so I'm now going to I'm going to say hello to you, and I'm going to turn the computer over to share my screen. And if it lets me now, here we are. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
Right, oh, hold on. Okay, so yeah, apologies for the computer situation. Something this always happens. So I'm delighted to be back in Aberystwyth. I'd rather be there personally. I haven't been so long, but it's quite convenient in many ways, of course, this way. So I want to talk to you about today about something that has recently become very close to my heart. And that is the Llibre Fets, the Book of Deeds, das Buch der Taten, which I foolishly agreed several years ago to translate into German, not being aware that it was not always only the longest medieval Catalan text, but also I was assured the most difficult. So we had some fun, James and I, over the years. But he was finally published in German in September, so that's nice. He's not been translated into Welsh yet, by the way, so if anybody feels inspired after this talk and has a few years to spare, there you go. Right, I will tell you a little bit about the king, because you may not be very familiar with him. I will then talk a bit about the book itself. I will then talk about kings and emotions, and then looking at expressing different emotions in the Book of Deeds. Now I start with the king himself. Now James I, known as the Conqueror, is perhaps the most famous of all the medieval kings of Aragon. He was the only surviving son of Peter II, the Catholic, and thereby heir to the crown of Aragon. And here he is in splendor. He was born in Montpellier on February 2nd, 1208. And in the Book of Deeds, James tells us about the circumstances surrounding his conception and his birth. According to what he tells us, his conception was indeed the result of an intrigue on the part of his mother, Marie de Montpellier, whose relationship with James's father, King Peter, was at that stage distant. In fact, he was trying to divorce her at this stage. But she managed somehow to seduce him by pretending to be his concubine. Apparently it was very dark. I'm not quite sure how she managed, but she did. And James was born 9 months later. He also relates how his mother came to choosing his name. And I will just tell you, because it's a nice little story. James's mother, when she was pregnant, she went to the church, and I'm reading here from the English translation of the Book of Deeds. She ordered 12 candles to be made, all of equal size and measure, and had them all lit at the same time. On each one, she placed the name of an apostle, and she promised our Lord that whichever candle burned longest would be the name we would receive. And that of St. James lasted a full 3 fingers' breadth longer than the others. Thus, for this reason, and through the grace of God, we have the name James. So there. This is just a little anecdote to start. In September 1213, Peter II fell in the Battle of Muret against Simon de Montfort, which made his son James an orphan at the tender age of 5, and it made him heir to a debt-ridden and fractional kingdom. Since James was a minor at Peter's death, the kingdom was initially ruled by 2 relatives, Sancho, Count of Provence and great uncle of the king, and by James's uncle Ferrando, both of whom, according to James, had intentions on the throne themselves. After his father's death, the young king was held at the court of Simon de Montfort, his father's opponent, and in fact, before Simon and Peter fell out, James had been promised in marriage to Simon de Montfort's daughter, so there was this link between the two. So he was held at the court of Simon in Carcassonne. He was eventually fetched from Carcassonne with papal help and taken to the Knights Templar fortress in Monthon, where he spent the remainder of his minority. His early reign was marked by conflict with his nobles, and in the Book of Deeds, James repeatedly emphasizes his inexperience at the time due to his tender age, which he says made it difficult for him to make decisions, both regarding his government and in the context of his first military expeditions. And he emphasizes this quite a lot, and he keeps saying, well, I decided this, but I didn't really know. I was only 8 years old at the time, and so on. So he emphasizes this quite a lot. At the age of 12, on the advice of his barons, he married Eleanor, the youngest daughter of Alfonso VIII of Castile. And in the same year, he was knighted. He himself tells us about both events in the Book of Deeds. In the years that followed, James increasingly began to adjust to his role as ruler. This meant coming to an understanding with his nobles on both sides of the Aragonese-Catalan border, establishing himself as a military leader and resuming his ancestors' struggle against the Moors on the peninsula. The king's often conflicting relations, especially with his Aragonese subjects, marked his long reign. I mean, there's problems that kept flaring up throughout his reign. But in 1227, James came to terms with the Aragonese nobility, and in the following years with the Count of Urgell, who had also caused him some trouble. He describes both of these occasions in the Book of Deeds. Right, move on to the next slide. Here he is. The growing stability in his reign was followed by James's most famous expedition, the conquest of Majorca in 1229, which he carried out with papal approval. James had planned this action for many months, the idea of which, according to his own account, came to him during a meal in Tarragona. And in fact, the image you have here on the slide, that's the king there on the right, having a meal with some of the members of his court. And it's unlikely it actually happened in the way that he tells. But it's quite interesting because in the oldest Catalan manuscript of the Book of Deeds, there are only 2 illustrations, and this is one of them. So it was clearly, I mean, it's possible that some have been cut out, but I mean, this nonetheless, I mean, it was not a heavily illustrated manuscript at all. So it's interesting that we have this, which I find very, very beautiful depiction here. The campaign dragged on from autumn to winter of 1229 and ended in success for the royal army, though at a cost. Among others who lost their lives in the conquest, 2 of Catalonia's great magnates, Guillem and Ramon de Moncada, were killed in Majorca. According to the Book of Deeds, the death of the Moncadas hit James hard and drove him to tears, and I will get back to that in a little while. The king himself stayed in Majorca for several months after his conquest until he brought the island completely under his control and administration. The subsequent conquest of Ibiza in 1235 and finally of Menorca in 1237, though Menorca had already submitted to the Crown of Aragon as a few years earlier, those conquests were not carried out by James personally, but rather in his name and under his patronage. The king's own next military campaign was the conquest of Valencia, which James began planning shortly after his return from Majorca, when he was still all in high spirits and fired up. Now, this endeavor turned out to be considerably more complicated and lengthy than his campaign in Majorca, and it was carried out in several stages. The king and his army began the expedition against the Moors in Valencia with a campaign in the north of the Taifa kingdom in 1231, and by the end of the same decade, they had succeeded in conquering the city of Valencia. So really, it dragged on for some time. The gradual advance of the Aragonese and Catalan troops into the southern part of the region finally completed the conquest of the Kingdom of Valencia. But James, in fact, was busy suppressing insurrections on the part of individual Muslim leaders in this new territory for many, many years afterwards. If he's generally celebrated today as a great liberator and conqueror, James's rule was by no means free from conflict. He was even excommunicated on a couple of occasions, first as a punishment for resisting the ordination of the Archbishop of Zaragoza, and later for cutting out part of the tongue of the Bishop of Girona, Berenguer. After, yeah, you shouldn't do that. But the latter had allegedly disclosed a confidential confessional secret from the king. And James was acquitted of the second offence in Lleida in 1246. But none of these events are mentioned in the Book of Deeds, perhaps unsurprisingly. His actions north of the Pyrenees were also controversial. In particular, the Treaty of Corbeil, made in May 1258 with Louis IX of France, was ultimately disadvantageous for James and his kingdom, who thereby renounced his rights to Occitania, while the King of France, in return, revoked his claims to various Catalan regions. James's last major successful military campaign was the reconquest of Murcia in 1264 in favor of the King of Castile, his son-in-law Alfonso X, who was faced with a series of Saracen revolts in Murcia that James succeeded in suppressing. This campaign he carried out with the help of his sons. And now I'll just put this up so you get a sense of, it's probably very, very small, sense of the expansions, the territorial expansion under James. During the last years of his life, James did not add any more military successes to his impressive record, though he planned to go on crusade to the Holy Land. Something that he kind of keeps mentioning. It's something that, you know, clearly bothered him that he hadn't done that. So, you know, he finally sets off in 1269, but he had to break off his campaign, allegedly due to adverse weather conditions. Though legend has it that he missed his mistress too much. So, but in any case, he didn't make it. 5 years later, he participated in the Council of Lyon under the auspices of Pope Gregory X. And he talks a lot about this in the Book of Deeds. And to me personally, this was really one of the most interesting sections of the Book of Deeds. I really found it fascinating how James tells us about his personal and direct encounters with the Pope. James's relations with the Roman Curia had not always been smooth, and we've just heard a little bit about that. But he hoped that his meeting with Gregory X would indeed result in his coronation by the Pope, which would have mirrored the coronation of his own father, Peter II, by Pope Innocent III in 1204. But it didn't quite work out. The Pope was not willing to comply with this request without the king making certain overdue payments, which went back a very long way. And James was not prepared to accept this condition. So the offshoot is that James's papal coronation did not happen. So he went back home without being crowned by the Pope. James was married 3 times, well, 2.5. First to Eleanor of Castile, from whom he separated after a few years and had the marriage annulled. Fruit of this union was a son, Alphonse, who was initially chosen by James as his heir, but who died in 1260, predeceasing his father. After the dissolution of his marriage to Eleanor of Castile, James married Violande of Hungary in 1235, who died in 1251, but with whom he had 9 or 10 children. And these include Princes Peter and James, who succeeded their father as Peter III of Aragon, also called Peter the Great, and James II of Majorca. And finally, the king married, I said 2.5 earlier because it wasn't an official marriage, but it had been sanctioned. He married Teresa Gilda Vidaura, from whom he got divorced or separated finally when she contracted leprosy. In addition, the king had numerous concubines, several of whom bore him children, and a number of his sons extramarital children, or sons especially, appear in the Book of Deeds. Right, now this is James I's tomb. We've got an image there at the Cistercian Abbey of Poblet. James's long life ended in the summer of 1276. While he was trying to restore order in Valencia, where various uprisings by the Muslim population demanded his intervention, I mentioned that earlier, that is really an ongoing headache for James, he was struck down by an illness from which he was not to recover. When he felt that he would indeed succumb to the disease, he took the habit of the Cistercian order in a symbolic act while on his deathbed. He also requested to be buried in the Cistercian monastery of Santa Maria da Poblet in Catalonia, and his wish was not initially granted. He was instead buried in the Cathedral of Valencia, but 2 years later, in 1278, his grave was transferred to the monastery of Poblet, where it remains to this day. So, and there you have him. So that's James's life in a nutshell. We'll now move on, and I'll tell you a little bit about the book itself, the Llibre dels Fets, the Book of Deeds. It's an exceptional piece of literature. It's luckily, because otherwise it would have been very tedious translating it, but really it was it is really quite extraordinary. It's an autobiography. The author is the king himself. Well, he was unable to write. He dictated, or he rather explained it. I don't think he really dictated it, but it's believed that he sort of explained it to an audience within his court. The authorship of the Book of Deeds has been subject to debate, though I think, personally, I think there can be little doubt that the king himself is the author of the work. It is an often very personal version of his life, not always flattering, that on the one hand reveals intimate description of his feelings, and on the other hand contains such detailed information about certain people and events to which hardly anyone except James himself could have had access. The events are always depicted from James's own perspective, and events in which the king himself was not present are usually only briefly described or are completely absent. But the king does not portray himself as an unblemished or unquestionable hero figure. So, for example, he includes many quarrels with his nobility and with the various ecclesiastical figures that surround him. He is often accompanied by bishops and by the masters of the temple and the hospital, for example. He mentions on several occasions that his subjects disobey him, so not putting himself in a glowing light there, but giving the work perhaps a touch of humility, which is perhaps equally important. And yet it is a very fine testament to his achievements as he wants them to be seen. The text was most likely composed towards the end of James's life. Again, there's some debate surrounding that, but I don't think we need to go into that now. And in fact, right up to the very end. The work does not have a title, but it is known as the Book of Deeds on account of a reference in the text itself, right in the second sentence of the work, where James speaks of our deeds. So it has always been referred to as the Book of Deeds. It's a unique work whose distinctiveness is not only that the author offers us an unusually personal vision for a medieval king, but also in that it is one of the very few royal autobiographies of the Middle Ages. It's not exactly a chronicle, but rather, as Damien Smith puts it in the introduction to his English translation, a succession of stories. The events described are not always in the correct order. We don't know whether it's this memory lapses or whether it's done on purpose. The language is vivid. The book itself is very oral in character, which gave me endless headaches trying to translate things at times. The accounts are occasionally humorous and livened up by the use of popular sayings and such like. It's really very, very much alive. It's the voice of the king, very present throughout, that reports the events in the first person plural. Only in exceptional cases and very occasionally does the author use the first person singular, especially when reproducing direct speech. But as almost always, he talks about we did and we said and so on. In the book, James repeatedly makes reference to the work itself, mostly by telling his audience that he's not telling every detail of some event or other in order to prevent the work from being too long. I've got just a little example here in chapter 6, where he says, he talks about his father. He was the most generous king there ever was in Spain and the most courteous, etc. And then he says, of the other good qualities that he had, we do not wish to speak, so as not to lengthen this work. And he does that on several occasions. And again, from the point of view as a translator, I'm quite glad that he did. So the book, oh no, hold on. The prologue and the final paragraphs were clearly written by someone else. They are different in style from the rest, rather more elegant. And some of it was clearly written after James's death. So I think it can be pretty certain it was not written by him. The book is one of the most important Catalan texts of the Middle Ages. The original has been lost, but various later copies of the text, 7 in all, survive. Since the oldest existing version of the Llibre Fets is the Latin translation by the Mallorcan Dominican Per Marsili from 1313, it has been suggested that this was in fact the original work, which was only later then translated into Catalan. But this has been sufficiently refuted on the basis of the text itself. And it is now generally agreed that Marsili instead used a now lost Catalan text as a model for his Latin version. The oldest surviving Catalan manuscript dates from 1343, and that's the page you see there on the left, and also the little image I showed you earlier. In the Book of Deeds, James tells us about selected events and incidents in his life, starting with his own version of the circumstances of his birth, I told you about a moment ago, dwelling a little on his inexperienced youth before launching into full accounts of his military campaigns and ending with his death. James repeatedly voices the conviction that he is part of a divine plan that began before he was born, protected him throughout his life, and allowed him to carry out his various military campaigns in order of the Almighty. Now, the king may perhaps be forgiven for viewing his long life as a kind of divine providence, since according to his own description, even his conception was extraordinary, as we have seen. As a baby, James also survived an attack on his life when a stone was thrown on his cradle but missed him by a few inches. And later on in his life, when the king was hit in the head by an arrow during a battle during the conquest of Valencia, he was fortunate in that it did not penetrate far enough into the skull to kill him. Now, he himself, of course, does not speak of luck, but declares that it was God's will that the arrow did not kill him. Already in the first chapter of the Book of Deeds, James announces that he has presented his autobiography to set an example for his successors, so that on the one hand, they'd be encouraged to follow his example as a successful ruler, and on the other, I quote from the English translation, so they should do as we have done and place their faith in this Lord who is so powerful. For it is thanks to the help and support of God and the Virgin throughout his life, so the king, that he accomplished what he did. The king's military campaigns form the heart of the Book of Deeds, and they go into a huge amount of detail. His successful conquest of Mallorca and Valencia take up the majority of the work. Military defeats, such as his unsuccessful siege of Peñíscola in 1225, he mentions seldom, scarcely, or not at all, unless they ultimately lead to the victory of his army, in the case, for example, of individual battles in the course of his great conquests. And these two then can be understood as examples that James would like to convey to his successors. His reports of the major military campaigns in Mallorca, Valencia, and Murcia are full of the most detailed information about his strategies, his army, and his relationships and conflicts with his men. And what makes the events so live and personal is the fact that he documents them from his own point of view, revealing his feelings in the process. And he's really very, very emotional, as we will see. Now I will move on and talk a little bit about kings and emotions. So a range of different emotions appear in the Llibre dels Fets: joy, sadness or grief, anger, anxiety, shame, contempt. James talks openly about them. Now, you might ask, how were expressions of emotions by kings regarded by others? Because James clearly selects what he tells us and how he tells us about these things. Emotions in the Middle Ages were for a long time a problem in historiography, at least since Johann Huizinga a century ago. There was a tendency to ascribe to medieval society an almost childlike simplicity, and I quote, impressionability of mind, a sensitivity to tears and spiritual repentance. Huizinga considered the medieval period as a premature epoch, and emotions, consequently, in his view, need to be considered with this in mind. Now, this was an influential attitude for some time, though the issue of medieval emotions has been very thoroughly revised over the past few decades. Nonetheless, as late as 1985, Peter and Carol Stearns claimed that, I quote, public temper tantrums, along with frequent weeping and boisterous joy, were far more common in pre-modern society than they were to become in the 19th and 20th centuries. Adults were in many ways, by modern standards, childlike in their indulgence in temper. But how were these feelings perceived at the time? Now, legal historian John Edward Jolliffe argued in 1963 in his book on Angevin kingship that the medieval English king's anger was an effective political tool, saying that, I quote, the ruler's personal hates and fears were released as efficient forces to play about the political world. And Gerd Althoff says about royal anger that it appears as part of the king's rulership practice, that is, as part of a personally grounded rulership based on a range of unwritten laws. What makes perhaps the strongest impression on the modern reader, however, is medieval weeping, especially in the case of warlords and big macho hero figures. And just give you here an image of James as he is popularly portrayed. This is his statue in Valencia, for example. Elena Gertzmann in the work on crying in the Middle Ages says that sacred and profane, public and private, emotive and ritualistic, internal and embodied, medieval weeping served as a culturally charged prison for a host of social, visual, cognitive and linguistic performances. Weeping was not considered unmanly or contradict the king's masculinity, but rather seen as displaying honest emotions. Significant here is why the weeping is done and who weeps. So, for example, grief is a legitimate reason for weeping, while pain is not. In the Book of Deeds, James weeps openly, but appears unmoved at others weeping. And we find a similar case in the early modern Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus, about whom the historian Jonas Liljeqvist tells us. So it's not just James. So it is significant who does the weeping, and there's clearly a time and a place for weeping. And James, after the death of the Moncadas, he in fact tells his men, now is not the time for weeping. So let's bury them and get on with it. What seems clear is that great men do cry. The historian Ferran Soldevila compares James's moments of weeping with those of other great men in history. So Achilles cries in the Iliad when they take Briseis, his concubine, from him, even goes out and calls his mother. who then asks him why he's crying. Roland cries in the Song of Roland, as does Charlemagne. El Cid cries in his epic poem, and there are more examples. So weeping is not incompatible with great heroic warlords. Now let's look at emotions in the Book of Deeds. Now, James I is a greatly popular and admired king in Catalonia and Aragon. And the popular image of James is that of the great conqueror king. And I've got a few images here. So it's him in Valencia, in the País Valencià. This is James in Mallorca. This is him in Montpellier, in Salou. All places that have some. Salou is where he left on his conquest of Mallorca. In Barcelona, and that's my personal favorite. That's Flat James. It's just kind of plastered against the wall on the Gran Via de Jaume I in Girona. I'm quite fond of him actually. I think it's quite sweet. But in his book, James himself paints a much more intimate portrait, and it's not always flattering. So I will now give you some examples. There are lots and lots and lots of examples. I'm not going to give you all of them because I don't think it's necessary, and we'll be here for a very long time. I've just chosen a few to illustrate his reaction in the face of joy, happiness, sadness, anger, anguish, or shame. Let's start with joy. So the Hospitallers cry with joy, and it's not just James doing the crying here. I've got examples from various characters in the book. The Hospitallers cry with joy and gratitude when James gives them land and goods in Mallorca. They kissed my hands, and the brothers wept while kissing them. James, a little bit later on, cries at the end of his emotional speech to his men when he's about to leave Mallorca. So he's leaving the men behind. He tells them, look, I'm going to go back to the mainland, but, you know, I'm with you in heart and in spirit, and so forth. So he said, you know, I will never abandon you. And he gets himself so worked up. And at the end of his speech, we began to cry, and they made their farewells. When he returns to the mainland, he meets Ramon Plegamans, one of his subjects, and Ramon begins to cry with joy at seeing him, and the great joy he felt on seeing us. So another example, a bit further down, James returns to Mallorca, and those men that he's left on the island weep with emotion and joy at seeing him on his return to the island. Now, this is quite a bit further on in the Book of Deeds. This is when James finally has achieved the conquest of the city of Valencia. And he weeps with emotion when he sees a standard upon the tower of Valencia. So we dismounted, we turned towards the east, tears falling from our eyes, and kissed the ground for the great mercy, and for the great mercy God had done us. He also gets emotional. So you see, he gets emotional for various reasons. He meets with the King of Castile. We left Tarazona, went towards Agreda, where we met the King of Castile, who had come out to receive us halfway there. He was very happy to see us. He embraced us 3 times, and we cried. So finally, and this is a very interesting part in the Book of Deeds, where James, who had all sorts of problems with his son, Prince Peter. He cannot stop tears from coming into his eyes at the reconciliation with his son. This had been, again, a conflict between the two men that had been going on for some time. So he explains, and Prince Peter apologizes, and, you know, my lord, what I've done greatly grieves me, and so on. So we could not stop the tears from coming into our eyes. So these are occasions of tears of joy. Let's look at sadness, because I'm quite aware that time is pushing on as well. So I will go through the examples rather more quickly. James cries at his cousin's departure from Monthon. At this stage, James is only a child. He is in Monthon. He's not yet been taken away from Monthon. His cousin, who was held there with him, tells him he's about to leave, and he's weeping out of sadness at the prospect of seeing his cousin depart. But he said at the same time, we're greatly pleased for him that he was able to leave. Now we get to the death of the Moncadas, and we've got a few examples here. And I must admit, when I was translating the book, I was so engrossed in the text that when I got to this section, I was almost crying myself. It took me so by surprise. You kind of feel you know these people by then. So he said, when we'd ridden the mile, this is during the conquest of Majorca, the Bishop of Barcelona said to us and said, Lord, for the love of God, do not hurry so. He says, why not, Bishop, if it is better so? And he said, I wish to speak to you. And the bishop then says to James, my lord, you have lost more than you realize, as Guillem de Moncada and Ramon are dead. What? Dead? We said, and we began to cry. And he's clearly very much taken with the death of the Moncadas. Later on, when they're about to recover the bodies from the battlefield, he said, let us not cry, as now is not the time for weeping. That's something I mentioned earlier. So they take the bodies from the field, and then he finds them a little bit later on. He finds them propped up, lying on mattresses just before they are buried. And he said, well, we stayed there a little while and crying, and afterwards we did the same over Ramon. So he was clearly very, very taken by this event, and here we have another example, of that. Right. Oh yes, here's again as another example where he tells them, you know, don't cry now. So after we said those words, they left off their weeping, and we buried them. So then, he was very, very sad when he heard the news that the King of Leon has died, and finally, this goes back to before the reconciliation with his son Peter. When in fact Peter tried and finally did kill his half brother, one of James's illegitimate children. He's greatly saddened and aggrieved when he hears about these actions. Though less so when Peter finally does kill his half brother. He kills him by drowning, no less. And James by then has kind of sees the arguments for that. Right, let's move on to anger, and I know I've got anger in the title. I have a few occasions, and I'm just giving you 3 examples here, just to do not kind of overload you with examples. I mentioned this a little while ago when I talked about James feeling that he's protected by the will of God, saying this is the occasion where he's hit in the head by an arrow during the campaign, the Valencian campaign. So by the will of God, the arrow did not go right through our head. And he does not feel pain, he claims. He says, because of the great anger that we felt, and we gave such a blow to the arrow that we broke it, and the blood was running down our face, yet we wiped the blood off with the silk cloak that we're wearing and went along laughing so that the army would not be alarmed. So I think it's quite an interesting portrayal of his own reaction, whatever happened in reality. But I think it's quite interesting how he presents himself, portrays himself of reacting in the face of the situation, of this great pain. I mean, imagine it must be quite painful if you get an arrow in your head. So anyway, right, another occasion, which again, very interesting example. Here, James is enraged because he worries that the Saracens might give the town of Xàtiva and Valencia to his estranged son. And he's so enraged that his counselors question the appropriateness of his rage. And again, he tells us about this. He said, well, you know, is it fitting for you to be so greatly and quickly enraged? And I think it's interesting. He tells us that. And the queen weeps. The queen began to cry and said that she was born in an evil hour because of all this hullabaloo. Very, very interesting example, I think. And the third example I have here. Oh no, this is still is continued from the previous slide, and the counselors actually say to the queen, you speak to your husband and tell him not to be angered and leave in such a rage. And the queen then, you know, goes to James and beseeks him, weeping, that we should not be in so great a hurry and should calm down a little bit. Now, my third example for anger in the Book of Deeds is this example here, where James is greatly saddened and angered because the Saracens captured 2 of his castles. This saddened and angered us greatly, as their audacity was so great that they had harmed us by taking 2 or 3 of our castles. Moreover, they did not wish. So they refuse to accept the offer he's made to them earlier of coming to an agreement. So these are some examples of anger. Now, anguish, very quickly, he tells us that we were filled with anguish when his men refused to obey his order to start marching. One of the occasions where he tells us very openly that his authority is being questioned here. And shame, that's not he himself, but he tells us that Berenguer Finestres is greatly ashamed and saddened at having lost Balaguer. So he tells us, as I said earlier, he tells us not only about his own feelings, but those of others as well. As just a little aside, I've got a couple of insults, and I'm just going to add them on. As on a few occasions in the Book of Deeds, James and his knights make use of almost Monty Python-esque insults. So one knight calls the other, you foul-smelling minion, you utter fool of a man, and again, you foul-smelling villain. This is just a little aside, so I don't really want to dwell on that at all. Now, by way of conclusion, the codes of conduct of what was appropriate behavior for a king were, of course, well defined. We need only look at the mirrors of princes from the Carolingian era that emphasized justice, piety, clemency, mercy, and patience. But emotions were naturally felt and expressed by medieval people, kings included, and they were not always easily controlled. The king's joy, the king's anger don't strike us as unusual, nor does the king's grief, except perhaps when it is expressed through an abundance of royal tears. The king's frustration and displeasure at the disobedience of his subjects surprises only in the sense that James tells us so openly about the anguish he feels and reveals what effectively amounts to failure on his part, or questioning or challenge to his authority. It is noteworthy, though, that James, for all the diverse feelings he expresses, seems never to feel fear, although those around him do. He's also rejecting any demonstration of physical pain, as when he's struck in the head by the arrow. Rather, he feels anger. So feelings were expressed, but within an accepted framework or scheme of behavior, and not, as has been argued by Huizinga and those following him, because medieval people were childlike and simple-minded, but rather because the public display of emotions, not yet charged to the same extent with the same associations as they are today, underlined, enhanced, emphasized the force and perhaps honesty of the sentiment. The king then, to use Gerd Althoff's words, demonstrated his determination to go to war with raging anger, his mildness with a flood of tears, and many of the mannerisms of medieval communication, says Althoff, which may appear to us as over-emotionalized, were bound up with this demonstrative function. James I, in his Book of Deeds, gives us an extraordinary insight into his emotions, describing his joy, sadness, anger, even his anxiety in the face of failure. Whether or not his successors, at whom his words were directed, paid much heed to them, as was his wish, I don't know. But it is a text so vivid, so alive, that when I was translating it, I sometimes really had to remind myself that this, this man, in fact, died nearly 750 years ago. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.